Welcome to the first official Edge Rowing podcast. It's my great pleasure to have had a conversation with somebody who's massively influenced approach to coaching and training, and not just when I'm coaching now, but when I was a rower myself, on how to train properly and maximize your training time and balance it as well, and just make training a bit more enjoyable. So our guest today is Dr. Charlie Simpson. He goes into loads and loads of detail on how you can implement polarized training. So if you've also never heard of polarized training, or you have but you're very unfamiliar with it, don't worry, we go into explaining it kind of from the fundamentals. And likewise, if you've heard about it or you're using it right now, there's also loads of value in it so that you can make it even better. So I'll take the perspective of sort of maybe a beginner, and I'm kind of asking him some questions from the perspective of perhaps somebody who's curious about polarized training. So hopefully that's helpful for you. But yeah, we go into his background, how he discovered polarized training, what convinced him that it works. So he was actually very similar to a lot of people who aren't using polarized training in the past. He was training hard all the time, and he eventually got convinced about it when he was doing more rowing training himself. We compare polarized training to other methods. We look at the science. We break it down to the basics, and all the way down to how you can figure out where your training zones are for polarized training, how you should structure your week depending on how many sessions you do per week, some of the coaching psychology as well. And then one thing I like, he covers other areas as well, like time management, and yeah, it's just a really interesting conversation I had with him. Charlie's also done loads of mentoring with me, but also like her athletes as well, so he's just got so much value. He's got a great book, which I'll link in the bio, Advanced Rowing. He's currently working on another one as well, which I'm not going to share just yet. Highly recommend checking out that book if you're interested in this conversation. There is one minor trigger warning. So at the end, and again, I'll do the warning again, but just some talk about, body weight and weight loss towards like the last 5 minutes of the podcast. So I'll put another trigger warning in there. I know not everybody is in a position where they should be listening to that sort of stuff. I'll shut up and play the recording. Enjoy. Welcome everybody to actually the first official episode of the Edge Rowing podcast. So we've done interviews before in a kind of rough format, but we're going to be basically doing a lot more of this, where we're aimed at bringing in who we view as the world leaders in their field, in the sport of rowing, and then also some of the best rowers. Have a chat with them and basically try and figure out what is it about their approach or their experience or knowledge that's unique, and how can we have a conversation in a way that gives value to you, the viewer, and gives you actionable pieces of advice that you can go away and implement after you finish. So guest number one is Dr. Charlie Simpson, author of Advanced Rowing, physiologist. Charlie, you can jump in and let me know if I'm missing anything here, but somebody who has mentored me in my coaching, and I read his book and it really changed a lot of my perspectives on how people should train for rowing. But yeah, Charlie Simpson, we're very lucky to have you here, and welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Awesome. So, Charlie, I thought we had a bit of a conversation before, but certainly we can go over some things. Obviously, I know you, but well, I'm sure a lot of the viewers or some of the viewers don't. So it maybe be good to just hear a bit of like your background, and kind of how did you get into the sport of rowing, and then how did you start to go down the path that led you to where you are now?
Yes, so I've always been involved in rowing. My parents were both very serious in their rowing. Growing up in Glasgow, I used to row with the teams down there. Did a lot of coxing from about age 9, and then got into a boat from age 10. So it's always been part of my life. I got very serious in competing in rowing and competed at various national championships in different places. But I'm also quite a small chap. I'm only about 5'8", and I'm even on the light side for lightweight back then. So one of the things that really interested me was, well, what can I do to try to improve my rowing performance? I can't grow anymore. So what could I do to try to get a bit faster? And one of the things I figured out was to go and basically listen to the best coaches, to learn from them. And one of the best ways you can do that is read. I mean, you can't easily just go and jump in a launch with the top rowing coaches all over the world. If you got a bit of time and some money, you get pretty far down that.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that really got me interested was to go and just read lots. And then that led to going and doing degrees in sports science, kinesiology,
Amazing.
sport exercise science, and
So just
eventually.
what were some of the first things that you took away as you started to kind of dive into it that you maybe felt like, guy who's 5 seconds ahead of you right now in the 2K, they're not doing it, and something you learned from starting to educate yourself more that maybe gave you a bit of an edge? What were those kind of like first things you discovered, if you can
I think,
recall?
yeah, I think, I mean, certainly when I was in my teenage years, starting to really think about this stuff, the first thing I went to, I think, which is quite understandable, is not physiology, it was technique. So I used to look at a lot
Okay.
of the training manuals, GDR training manuals, British rowing type materials, just looking at technique, because that's the bit that you can see. You can see somebody's longer stroke, or you can see the body sequencing. You cannot see somebody's heart changing. You cannot see
Yeah.
somebody's blood volume expanding. So the physiology came later, but it's also why a lot of rowers dominate their conversations around things like rigging, things like equipment, things like technique. The things that you can see are the first obvious targets. If I was to think about the training that really first got me interested in this academic study more was, I was growing up as a teenager back when, Britain had really good middle distance runners, Steve Ovett, Seb Coe. They were the two guys. When I was,
Okay.
10 years old watching the Olympics, it was the Steve Ovett, Seb Coe thing going on. So for anybody over the age of about 40, this will resonate. For anybody age 20, they have no idea who we're talking about. But anyway, these two guys who were trading world records with each other over a period of months in the 800, running in 1500, they were running, split seconds faster than each other. They had two very different training approaches. Seb Coe had a very high intensity, generally low volume. Steve, when I say low volume, Seb Coe wouldn't run more than 30, 40, 50 miles in a week. And he's an elite 141, 800-meter runner on the track. Steve Ovett doing the same, 142, that thereabouts. He was doing 100 miles per week. So you have two guys running very similar world record times, trading the world record, but with very different training approaches. So that's the first sort of stuff that I really started to dig into. Well, what's going on with the training and how does that drive the physiology?
Okay. And then I mean, I don't know the story at all, but so I can't remember, is the guy doing the volume did he start to overtake Seb Coe?
No, I mean they
Ah,
were they were very much
the
on
same.
par with each other. I mean, you could argue, you could make a case for Sebco maybe had this slightly more successful career, but they're both Olympic medalists, gold medalists. Sebco, I think, won the 1500 in Moscow, 1500 in Los Angeles. But yes, I'm sorry, because you're so young, you wouldn't know these things.
Yeah.
Sebco is now the head of the International
Uh-huh.
Athletic Federation, was a conservative politician for many years. So you would come across them in different fashions. But really fantastic era for British distance running, and it opened up this example of two very
Hmm.
different training approaches. Now, that's for 800 and 1500-meter running. And 800 meters is very interesting because you can be a really good 400-meter sprinter and come up to the 800 and be successful, or you can be a really good distance runner, the 1500s, the 3000s, the 5Ks, and you can come back down to 800. So you can 800 in track is that middle gap between people who are endurance focused versus sprint focused, because the 800-meter is just like a long sprint. A lot of what was driving the philosophy of training in the rowing world was coming out of athletic programs, out of swimming programs, and out of cycling programs. So we take a mix from those things, but
Hmm.
very common to sit by the Clyde back in Glasgow in the day and hear people talking about what the Eastern European endurance athletes were doing. And a lot of what we take in terms of back then, in terms of our approach to rowing, was influenced by weight training programs. And the whole idea of periodization actually comes out
Oh, did it?
of Eastern European philosophies around strength training approaches. And then it just got transformed into, well, this is how you could then implement these weight training periodizations into endurance training. So without getting into the weeds of the history, a lot of where we are today has been influenced by the sort of stories of the Coes, the Ovets, the European model of endurance training, the Eastern European model of strength training. We take these little bits over time and pull them together into basically what we have in the form of modern training.
Mhm.
Training evolves over the decades.
That's yeah, I think that's so interesting to kind of like learn. That's what I'm always trying to do is you look at different sports and coaches approaches to not just training but also like psychology. There's so many crossovers. Um, for you then, so what was it that started to get you focused in on polarized training? So actually, for those that don't know, this is Charlie's background and what he talks a lot about is polarized training. So I'm sure a lot of you are aware of it, but at the same time, we're aiming to go into it in enough detail so that if you haven't heard about it before, you can kind of walk away with this with a better understanding. So we'll get into that in a second. But Charlie, what was it that first got you focused in on polarized training?
I'm a rather late adopter. I mentioned that whole Seb Coe thing, and on that side of the debate, I took the Seb Coe side through my training career and through a lot of my coaching for rowing. I was very much let's go for quality, and instead of doing 100-mile type weeks, let's focus
Interesting.
on the 50. So I was very much dominated that way. Now, when you talk about polarization, it's very hard not to talk about Steve Seiler. Steve Seiler is
Yeah.
the guy who, in the late 90s, really kicks off this research looking at how Norwegian athletes trained over the previous decades. And he's got a study where he looked at the training diaries of Norwegian rowers over a period of about 20, 30 years. And he catalogues the changes in the way they trained. And one of the things that he spotted was as the Norwegian Olympic success improved, they moved to less high intensity and more long duration exercise. And if you look at the model of cross country skiing in Scandinavia, it is very dominated by long, slow distance. In other words, what's probably happening is a lot of the Scandinavian Norwegian rowers started to move away from the interval training influences, which actually came out of Germany in the 1960s. And they started to move to what the cross country skiers did, which was this long, slow distance stuff. Steve just came along. He didn't change the training. He'll tell you that very quickly. He just came along and cataloged it and put this term polarization. And the idea of polarization is that you have your training intensities distributed between two poles, the high intensity pole and the low intensity pole. But you don't evenly distribute your training when you look at the diaries of elite endurance athletes. The majority of the training time is spent at the low intensities, below lactate threshold. So 80% of time on average of elite endurance athletes is spent in this low intensity, sub 2 millimole lactate area, less than 70, 75% heart rate max. That's what we mean by low intensity. And then the remaining 20% of time is distributed between that moderate threshold type zone and then the very high intensity race pace, 2K race pace. How you distribute that 20% is where people talk about either truly polarized zones, where you have very little time spent in that middle threshold type area. In other words, you're truly
Yeah.
polarizing. Your 80% is low intensity and maybe 10-15% is high intensity, and only 5%, the balance of that time, is spent in that threshold zone. That's what we mean by a classic polarization. But there's a subtle take on this idea of 80% low intensity, 20% moderate and high intensity. And that subtle take is captured by the term pyramidal rather than polarized training. And pyramidal training is where maybe you'll have 80% low intensity, maybe you'll have 15% in that middle zone, and then only 5%, let's say, in the very high intensity zone. But without getting into the weeds on polarization versus pyramidal, both those approaches differ from this sort of threshold type model of high
Okay.
intensity threshold dominating large parts of the training. So when I
So
talk about polarized training, I often mean pyramidal as well as a loose
okay.
term. But what I'm broadly saying is 80% or more of people's training time should be this low intensity, what rowers will call UT2, basically.
Okay, so for example, say I'm doing 6 sessions a week, not including weights. If I was following a polarized training program written by you, what would that look like?
Basically, 4 or 5 of those sessions would be UT2 long, low intensity, and then 1 or 2 would be moderate and high intensity sessions.
Okay, and then so one thing sometimes people can get stuck up on a little bit with this is their actual time in a training session when they're in that theoretical high intensity zone. So say you're doing a 30 rate 20 max effort. and you have one of those a week, but perhaps maybe only the last 10 minutes of that 30-minute is high intensity, would you not class those first 20 minutes as high intensity, or do you view it as the whole session despite, the fact you take a bit of time to build into these zones?
You're keeping the pace the same throughout, are you not? Because you're rate 20, you're not
Yeah.
changing the pace. So to me, that is a threshold type workout. It's not a high intensity in the classification scheme. And that's one of the challenges of, I didn't, the whole idea of why I don't worry too much about pyramidal versus polarized
Right.
is partly related to this issue. The heart rate at the start of that 30-minute session will clearly be in the threshold zone. But
Hmm.
as you start to move through the 30 minutes, it will drift up. So by the end, it will be in your high intensity zone. And it begs this question, well,
Yeah.
is that a moderate intensity session or is it a high intensity session? To me, that is clearly moderate intensity workout. That's threshold. If we measure the lactate, you're going to be in that 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 millimoles zone at most. It is clearly a threshold moderate intensity zone. But because you're implying the use of heart rate to define the zone, heart rate varies over time. It's one of the limitations of using heart rate as a indicator of people's different zones. If you want to know what your low intensity zone is, the single best way, and probably the only way I think you can do it, is to truly work out somebody's lactate threshold power. Anything below that stays in the UT2 zone or below or less.
Okay. So just say, because sometimes I've heard people getting kind of caught on that a little bit. You would say, anybody there like at home that's maybe getting confused about this, splitting up your sessions. So could you walk me through just an example? Somebody training on the rowing machine, say 3 or 4 times a week, and then 5 or 6 times a week, and then maybe on the rowing machine 8 or 9 times a week. How would you split those into polarized training methods? How would you break those down?
It, it it will depend on the time of the year, but to basically
Okay.
give you an idea, I mean, maybe on the Monday you might do, if this is an intermediate athlete, you might say, well, let's go and do 90 minutes at truly UT2 pace. So your heart rate is probably around 7% of heart rate max. By 20 minutes into the session, the heart rate peaks out and it just stays steady for the rest of that
Yeah.
90-minute session. It's a long, low intensity, easy 90-minute session. The person gets off the erg at the end saying, that was easy. I feel like I've worked, but I don't feel absolutely exhausted.
Yeah.
And the heart rate trace stays nice and steady.
So is that, just to jump in there, is that another good indicator for people? Is that the heart rate stays steady, that they're in
Yes,
the right splits?
yes. There are some caveats to that. And if you want to look at how you can actually check when you're in the UT2 type zone, then we could move into that maybe later. But
Yeah.
I do think people undervalue the potential to look at heart rate stability over long, steady state sessions. There are caveats to that around fluid intake,
Yeah.
temperature,
Heat.
other
Yeah.
things. But it's a very good way to check. And so I do want to come back to that because it is important. You've then got 3, 4 sessions left, and they are just variations of the same idea. And I might go and do the next session. It might be a 60-minute UT2, and maybe we'll throw in a few short bursts of power. Now, here's a really key point. Let's say you go and do 60 minutes truly UT2, but you throw in, 3 times 20 firm. If you're talking to rowers, we throw in 3 times 20 firm just to break up the session. That is still a classic low intensity session. Don't worry about those minor undulations and stressing yourself over, well, hang on, we did 57 minutes of long, low intensity training, but we probably did about 3 minutes of high intensity. The goal of the session was clearly to stay low intensity. So one way you can categorize your training program is the intent of the session.
Yeah.
Is this meant to be low, moderate, high intensity session? And that's fine. And all you're trying to do in the session is make sure people stay there. You can use heart rate monitors, and heart rate monitors are pretty good because it's a
Okay.
measure of the internal stress of the person, but it's got some complexities in that you don't actually know where your UT2 zone is just based on heart rate. There are guidance. If you look at most training
Okay.
guides, you will see that people will define their UT2 somewhere in the region of 60 to 75% of heart rate max. You have to look closely because sometimes people talk about maximum heart rate. Sorry, they talk about heart rate reserve and different approaches, but let's keep it simple and
Yeah.
just talk about percent of heart rate max. Classic UT2 is in that 65 to 75% of heart rate max. It's
Yeah.
a good loose indicator, but you don't know what's going on with the lactate. To
Okay.
me, the best way to define somebody's UT2 is working out where is the lactate basically staying around 1.5 or thereabouts, give or take, 0.3 millimole. If you're, between 1.2 and a 1.8, lactate, it's very
Yeah.
hard for anybody to say that's anything other than UT2.
Loads of good information there on how to figure out you're in the right zone. So just going back then quickly, to the makeup of a 4 session week, 6 session week, and then say an 8 session week, all of those on the rowing machine. How it,
I'll try to summarize basically what I would do. If you had a 4 session a week, I would probably put in 3 distance sessions as long as I could get you to do. All right, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, somewhere in there. So 3 of the sessions are going to be a variation on anything between 45 and
yeah,
90 minutes of predominantly low intensity session. And then that fourth session, I'll let you hit it hard.
send
Either
it.
a moderate or a high intensity session, depending on the time of the year. If it's earlier in the year, it would be
Yeah,
more like a moderate, 3 times 15 minutes, best pace or near to best pace. If it's later in the year and you've only got that fourth session to be the high intensity workout, it would be something classic like 8 times 500 meter repeats with 2 minute recovery. That's what you would do on a 4 minute 4 session per week program.
a
Now,
four
if
minute
you
program,
say,
you could get a lot of people to sign up to that, I'm sure.
if you
Yeah,
go from 4 sessions a week, let's double
yeah,
it to 8.
gotcha.
What's changing? I'm going to basically shift more low intensity as a proportion
Yeah,
of your total training time. So you might now only do 1 or even 2 high intensity or moderate intensity sessions. So as you expand the number of sessions the person can do, that use of high intensity, moderate intensity type work, I would tend to dilute that
yeah,
and try to expand the volume that people are doing. So instead of doing 90-minute rows, I might try to push you out to 2-hour rows. Because if you're training 8 sessions a week, you could either break up with more sessions to get your 2 hours. You could do 2 times 1 hour across the day, or you can just do 2 hours straight through, but long, low intensity session. Once you increase people's training capacity, their ability to do more volume goes up. So the driver behind a lot of these polarization programs is not simply redistributing the intensity toward more low intensity
yeah,
work. It's not just that. It's that the absolute total volume of training also goes up. So in a polarized system where you move from 4 to 8 sessions per week, you're doing a greater proportion of your time in the low intensity zone, but you're also doing more volume totally. So the total amount of work you're doing low intensity may actually more than double if you put those 2
gotcha.
points together. Greater proportion of low intensity and a doubling of the total number of training sessions.
That's a good, I think, understanding on how to figure out where your UT2, your low intensity splits are, how to break up your week as well. It'd be good to just get a bit more into like the actual understanding of why does it work. And I think people can copy a program or listen to a coach and just buy into it. But I think always, even if you're already bought in, understanding why polarized training works helps you execute the training program so much better. I guess it's a bit of a vague question, but why does polarized training work for getting people faster? Again, as you're saying before, with those runners, it's a bit counterintuitive to do easy stuff all the time. Could you go into like why you have found it works?
It's one of those things. There are a couple of key reasons that people tend to come up with. The first one is it's just possible to do more training and to recover better. By keeping your easy days easy, it lets you make the hard days harder, basically. In other words, by taking it easy, you develop more volume, you develop more distance, and then, and this is the really key point,
Mm.
a polarized program doesn't exclude high intensity training. It just reserves the high
Yeah,
intensity training for a small proportion of time. But when you come to do those high intensity sessions, you really hit it hard. And the
yeah,
quality of what you're doing in those high intensity sessions, in other words, the split or the power that you're outputting should go up as a consequence of doing these easy days easy and
yeah,
building up this wide volume. One of the things that I guess is a concept that people have to get their head around is, well, why do we do all the high intensity stuff toward the end of the season? Now, there's no reason why you can't do high and moderate intensity through the season, but a classic periodized program, classically, you start with building volume, you keep the intensity low. And as the season progresses, you reduce the volume somewhat and you increase the intensity over time. So you have that classic periodization. The
Yeah.
whole idea of building your aerobic base early in the season is so that when you come later into the season and you're now ready to do the specific high intensity work that really gives you the final fitness gain, the whole idea is the quality of the foundation, that aerobic foundation that you've been developing all through the winter months, all that long, slow distance training. It's like putting money in the bank, and then you come to spend that money when you come to the high intensity interval training toward the summer, toward the peak of the season. And you get this gain, that last gain of fitness, that 2, 3, 4,
Hmm.
5% gain in performance. The idea, and it's an idea, it's difficult to show this experimentally, but the idea is the greater gains that come from the sprint training later in the year, that the interval intense work that comes late in the year, those gains are related to the quality of the long, slow distance aerobic volume that you
Okay.
put in the beginning.
So
And
why does the long, slow intensity work? Like, what, somebody could maybe be like, okay, well, if I want to improve my endurance, like you say, you can do more volume. But, I know that someone in my team or my, the best erg in the boat, their erg score is this. They do this UT2 at this split. I'm just going to go off and hold their UT2 split, and then I will adapt my splits to that endurance. Like, why does it work in the different way where you just need to build the volume while keeping strict on where your zones are? Why is the low intensity so important, and why does it work so well for building endurance?
If you look at training books on this, one of the things they'll talk about is if you really want to develop the peripheral adaptations in the body, so the things that happen in the leg muscles, the arm muscles, there is a sort of conventional view. It's not easy to show this experimentally, and I sort of have my issues around it. But if you
What
really
are your
want,
issues? Well, I'd be curious before you jumped in.
well, let me give me the issues after I give you the
Okay.
answer, because then the whole idea for me is that it's the symbiotic building of both the adaptations in the muscle, the skeletal muscle, with the adaptations that happen in the center that drive overall performance. It's we try to break things down into their components, but sometimes when you break things into their individual physiological components, you lose sight of the greater whole.
Okay.
The point of the long, slow distance training, why does all this 80% low intensity work so well? At least in terms of the physiological adaptations, what we're really speaking about there is driving up the quality of the mitochondria. The mitochondria are these little
They're the
powerhouses
powerhouse
of the
of the
muscle cell,
cell.
the batteries of the cell. And they're
Yeah.
very
Good
responsive
old
to
high school biology.
that's it. If that's what basically takes the carbohydrate, takes the fat, and converts it into ATP, the ATP being the energy that you use to power the muscle. In other words, if you want to make your muscles very good doing exercise over a long period of time, the single best thing you can do in the muscle is generate lots of mitochondria. The mitochondria is where you find the aerobic enzymes that are responsible for this process. If you want really oxidative muscles, you want to have lots of oxidative enzymes, then you want lots of mitochondria, these little organelles that you build that are the sites of the chemical processes that make
Okay.
the
And then
ATP.
just to jump in there, why does pushing harder when you're doing this endurance work, does that not increase the rate at which mitochondria get produced, or is it
It does. And that's one of my issues. There are two
okay?
ways that you can make lots of mitochondria. You can do long, low intensity sessions, and that will build lots of mitochondria, or you can do short, high intensity repeat intervals.
What about
Both will
long,
drive it up.
hard intensity sessions? Like that's just what we come across quite a lot is that people will just go as hard as they can for their UT2. Well, not UT2, and then go as hard as they can for their high intensity.
That's
Why is that
that's
a
great.
problem?
From a physiology point of view, that's still a great way to make loads of wonderful adaptations. The problem is that we're talking about an isolated session, and a training program is
Okay,
a
yeah.
sequence of many sessions, and you've got to be able to weather the distance from the season. If you the problem of just going, I mean, you could just go out and say, well, I want to do a 2K, sub 6 minute 2K erg. So every day for the next 30 days, I'm just going to smash a 2K out every day. Even
Yeah.
if you were a robot and you could tolerate the mental stress of doing 30 2K efforts, the body would break down trying to do that. It would stagnate. So variation in training is one of the ways that we've learned to avoid issues of overtraining. So we don't just go out and do hard sessions every day. Now, if you're only training 3 times a week, all right, you could go do that and you'd probably be fine. And it would be a pretty good training program. Wouldn't feel very humane, but if you're only doing 2, 3 sessions a week, you could do those 3 sessions as hard as you want because you will recover in time for the next session. You're not doing it every single day. You're not doing it twice a day.
I saw
But
one study that really influenced my opinion on this, and it was basically two groups of the same training program, same split, and they're both their volume work. One group did it at like what you might call proper UT2, and then one group did it more into the kind of mid-intensity threshold intensity. And they found that there was the average increase was the same in both groups, but in the one that was doing the hard stuff, they had a higher risk of some people getting slower and overtraining.
is this a rowing study?
I don't think it was. I think it was maybe a cycling one.
There's certainly a rowing study Steve Ingham did that's very similar to what you've just described, where you have these extremes of basically people doing long, low intensity, very little, practically no high intensity session. And then you have people doing in another group much more high intensity work. And then they look at the changes in 2K erg time over the course of, I mean, on this top of my head, 10 weeks, something like that. And they don't find everybody improves their 2K erg score, but they don't find better differences
Yeah.
between the two groups. Now, they also measured lactate thresholds in these two groups, the long, low intensity group versus the introducing lots of interval-based training. Now, what did change favorably in the long, low intensity group was lactate threshold increased to a greater extent than in the interval-based group. That to me makes some sense because one of the things that long, low intensity training is doing, developing the mitochondria, developing the aerobic enzymes, I can see because what drives lactate threshold is the quality and the amount of the mitochondria in the muscle. When you say to somebody, you want to increase your lactate threshold by 10%, what you're saying is you want to increase your mitochondria quality and quantity because that's what's going to give you that 10% increase. So in that study, they certainly found greater gains in lactate threshold in the longer low intensity group. They're not volume matched, and I think that's the
Okay.
caveat to that study.
Right.
If you do more training, more long low intensity training, you can tolerate the training better, and I think it's commensurate with greater gains in lactate threshold. They don't see any greater improvement in their 2K time at that point in the season. My answer is yes, but you've got to carry this on for longer
Yeah.
periods to see those real gains. So to summarize that, what I'm advocating for is the use of long, low intensity training. If you're going to do serious training, and I should be very careful here because like I say, if you're only doing 3 sessions a week, you might be better off just doing high intensity, moderate intensity the whole time. What I'm talking about is people who are doing 5 hours of training per week, at least, at least 50 kilometers or more of training per week. That's when we get into this area where recovery starts to really matter. Those are the people who I think can benefit from polarized approaches. Those are the people who will develop mitochondria best by increasing the amount of long, low intensity training that they do, cashing in those training gains later in the year when they throw in the high intensity interval.
Okay.
That's a lot of things that we're cutting across. So hopefully people are connecting with that in a way that they can
Yeah.
actually use. But it is important to identify the type of people who would benefit from this long, low intensity type training. I might go back. You asked me a question earlier about, how I got into this. And I was saying, well, no, I was one of those people who just wanted to do 6 sessions a week of sort of moderate and hard training. Now, it's not possible to do 6 sessions, I think, a week of rowing on water training without doing some low intensity, right? Think about the rowers who push off. They push off from the dock and they spend 20 minutes doing little pick drills and little slide drills. You're
Standing
actually
rigger dips.
yeah, that's it. You're actually doing quite a lot of low intensity training without that necessarily being the goal of the session. So that actually any standard rowing program already has quite a lot of low intensity built in almost by accident. Why? Because it's a lot easier to work on technique when you're just paddling long, low intensity. That, by the way, is one of the great reasons why rowers benefit from using polarized approaches, you can spend more time concentrating and thinking about technique. That's one of
Yeah,
the
getting in
benefits of the
time.
approach.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was one of those people who would go out and, yes, I'd do the short warm up for 10 minutes and then, right, let's get into 10-minute intervals or let's go do sprint intervals. And I did pretty well on that. You can do pretty well on the back of lots of high intensity training. But I was never doing 100 kilometers of rowing per week. I might do up to 80 kilometers per week, but I wasn't really pushing the high end of the volume. And if I could go back knowing what I now know, I would have told myself to chill out the intensity and try to just relax, enjoy the distance. Probably later we should get into the reasons why people don't stick to UT2 intensity. And I was one of those people. Now, it took me a long time reading books. I would hear about all these athletes, long, low intensity works better. I said, yeah, that's fine. But I'm in the Seb Coe camp. I'm doing fine on the high intensity. Thanks very much. And over time, I sort of got this little itch that maybe I should try something different. Now, I mentioned Steve Seiler, and when I was pushing off from the dock 30 odd years ago in Austin, Texas, where I was rowing, I was pushing off next to Steve Seiler, who was rowing in the boat next to me on the same lake and the same place in Austin. It just so happened that Steve was rowing in the same club and at the same university that I was at in the same department. So I knew Steve socially long before he had developed the idea of and popularized the idea of polarization. He's a friend of mine. So years later, Steve works in Norway and I work in Oxford, and I organize guest speakers. So I started to invite and pay for Steve to come and talk to our students and do some public lectures. So he'd stay in fact, he'd stay in this room. This used to be the spare bedroom. So Steve would stay
Nice.
here and he and I would just sit with
Is that
beers.
why he doesn't come round anymore? Sorry, Steve. It's the York room now.
Well, no, we put him downstairs. We made a second room. COVID changed it.
Nice. Get him on the
But
couch.
basically, it took several visits from Steve to say, Charlie, I'm not going to force this down your throat, but I really think you might want to try this long, low intensity stuff. And I was like, nah, Steve, this doesn't work for me. And really what changed me was not just having the disciple of polarization telling me to do it and giving me all the help I could possibly want to do it. What really changed me and forced me to do it was, believe it or not, having children. When I had young children, I could not jump on this air, smash out a 10K, and then walk out that door and put the kids in the bath because I was wrecked. It would take me 20 minutes to
Yeah.
recover from that session. What really converted me was the fact that normal life had to resume as soon as I finished my
That's a
training.
huge thing.
That's
That's
when
a
I saw the
huge thing for
benefits.
us as well because that's kind of one of the questions I had later was, um, yeah, there's so many programs you hear about. And I've been on programs as well that have worked for me and got me very quick, where it's very hard all the time. But yeah, looking at the lifestyle, it's like if you can have both the same results, but just like so much more of a sustainable training program, I think, yeah,
Well,
it's
this is
100%
where,
the way to
again,
go.
to complete my own road to Damascus experience, what blew me away was that I was training so much. I mean, I would sit, and I was lightweight, right? So I would sit on a 155, 200 split. If I wasn't lower than 200 per 500, I didn't think I was training. Then when Steve really convinced me to change this, along with life getting in the way, I had to drop it back to 215. And it felt so pedestrian and it felt
Yeah.
like it just didn't work. But it meant I could service the family requirements and I carried it on. But I also did the thing Steve said, you've got to make sure you do this as well, which is you don't just go slower, you increase the volume. Instead of just doing
Yeah.
10K rows, I'll happily go and do half marathons. Every week I'll do a half marathon just for the sake of a long, hour and a half, hour 35 on the air. Over time, I could see my performances, 5K, 10K, 2K, they were improving. And here's the crazy thing. I'm 47 now. I can pull the same or better splits on the air now than when I was doing all that training back at age 21. So to me, that
Wow.
blows me away. Being that much older, I'm still lightweight, still comfortably 70 kilos. So it convinced me that if I could go back and know what I now know as a 21-year-old and convince me to change, and it took that whole experience that I'm telling you there, took not just having the guru of polarization shooting the breeze over a beer, talking through these lectures, telling me why, reading lots of research papers, PhDs, all this kind of stuff, all that knowledge in the world didn't convince me to change. What convinced me to change was the necessity to fit training around my life. When I finally did that, the benefits blew me away. So if there's somebody out there who really has to say, I was wrong for all those years, I'm that guy. I'm going to
I
turn
love
around and
that.
say, I really wish
Well,
I had changed.
one thing, I'm always observing, I try to like the best coaches in the world and hear them speak. And one thing I've always noticed is that coaches don't speak, the best ones don't speak with certainty. They're not like, this is the best way to do a training program. This is the best technique. 100% it is because this X, Y, and Z. They're always talking about it like, I think this is what I found. And in my experience, it's been like this. They have that open mind. And I just think that's such a good approach because you can have a concept that you can apply to a lot of people, but you still need that flexibility. And I think when you go into it with rigidity, you're leaving speed on the table for that individual. So it's really cool to hear you talk about that with openness, obviously like a world leader, and you're still admitting when you were wrong. So I think again, and likewise, yeah, some of the worst coaches I've ever experienced are the ones that are just not going to name any names, but just this is the best way to do it. So I think would be a cool take home for people to have as well.
It's very interesting. I mean, to say you were wrong about something, it's not something that comes easy or natural to humans, but it is something that good scientists are meant to do. You're supposed to look at the evidence and be
Yeah,
willing to look at the evidence and change your mind. So I've had that experience. I still have to say that you've got to be very careful as a coach that you don't have your athletes doubting you or doubting your system. And so
yeah,
to
it's a
some extent,
balance.
I do see a value in an athlete having a core philosophy that they punch over and over into the athlete. You've got to do it this way. This is what we do. Because then you have consistency. And what you don't want is athletes sitting at the start line of a serious race,
Mhm.
nervous, doubting what they've done. They have to have total belief and total buy-in to what
Yeah,
they're doing.
it's a
So
fine balance.
that's right. I mean, the coaches showing uncertainty, that's what they should be talking about with the other coaches in the debriefings and the start of the year meeting. And then you do what the best coaches in the world do. They have a core philosophy and they edit around the
Yeah,
edges. They try something different. Maybe we'll do more weights this year, or maybe we'll do a bit more long UT2. They don't do what I described was a wholesale change, going from 50-kilometer weeks of high intensity, moderate intensity threshold type training, and let's move to UT2 80-90% of the time. That's a big dramatic change. That's not what any good coach would do. They would do it bit by bit, gradually moving from
hmm
a threshold based approach to a polarized approach. Now, that is a good practical consideration for lots of people listening to this. Nobody's saying you have to make big changes. But if you're doing 5 sessions a week and two of them are moderate and high intensity, what I'm saying is, well, why not drop one of those moderate and high intensity and go long on that session? Do a 15 or 20-kilometer easy session. Gradually introduce differences. That's not
hmm
that's not saying you're wrong. That's experimentation, and every good
Yeah,
training program is an experiment with an N of one, that individual person.
yeah. No, that's very well said. Just going quickly back then to what you said. So, what would you say to your younger self without maybe the ability, like you've just created a time machine, you can't show them your splits from 2024.
Yes.
What would be your argument for the
I
naive
think
21-year-old?
the
Or
single
yeah.
the single best thing, and I was stubborn, I am stubborn, I'm still very stubborn, but knowing how stubborn I was, is there one thing that could change my mind? I think it would be not here's the physiology, not here's all the rationale. The one thing that I think might have changed my mind is if somebody could have shown me the evidence of this is how real elite athletes, this is how your competitors that are beating you are actually training. That would have changed me. We are all slaves to the success of others. I mean, I talked earlier about a lot of rowing programs adapt from successful other sports, endurance sports.
hmm
What really I think might have convinced me was to see what other people do. Now, in the 1980s and 1990s, heart rate monitors were starting to become popular, but we were only just getting the internet. Now, if I was to talk to my son, if my son gets into rowing and I have to convince him of the same thing, because I suspect I'll have the same discussion that I had with myself as an adult, I think I'll have to have with him in a few years' time. What I would do is I would go to Strava and I'd find his favorite endurance athletes and say, right, let's go and look at their training. Look at the heart rate. A lot of the top athletes in the world broadcast all their training. And what you can see very easily, a lot of these training programs, they're going out and doing an hour and a half, 2 hours, and the heart rate's barely ticking over 120, 125. And it's lovely and steady. Remember that thing I said earlier about
Yeah.
you're in UT2 if you've got a nice steady heart rate over the 2 hour steady state session. You can see these elite rowers. You can see them having these beautiful steady state heart rates, 120, 125. Well, that can only be UT2. All this sort of research that Steve Seiler and people do is all they do is they pull all that into a published, peer-reviewed publication, but it's basically the same thing. It's lots of training diaries, but it's dressed up in fancy language. Now, you can look for the physiology changes. And so maybe you can try to show people these sort of studies where you've got a polarized approach and you've got a threshold approach, and you try to show them things like, well, as I said earlier with Steve Ingham's study, you try to show these markers improving to a greater extent with the polarized approaches. But I can broadly summarize a whole bunch of literature on comparing polarized, threshold, pyramidal type literature. I can summarize all that by saying long-term endurance gains are either similar when you have threshold and polarized training programs, or they are superior with polarized programs. In other words, you can find lots of studies, not lots, you can find a decent number of studies where there are no greater gains in those threshold-driven programs versus the polarized pyramidal type programs. But you don't usually find studies where the threshold outperforms the polarized. You usually find the threshold and polarized programs are similar, or the polarized programs win out.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Because there's caveats about who benefits from polarized approaches. If your training study consists of subjects who are only doing 40, 50 kilometers of running per week, there's not any great reason to think they will do superior on a polarized program
Okay.
versus a threshold. If they're doing 100 kilometers per week, then that's when I think you would see the benefit of the polarized approach superior to the threshold. And you can dig into the physiology of that as to try to give justification for why polarized might be the way to go. But people are
Okay.
stubborn. People don't really. I mean, I'm sitting here with all these degrees in physiology, and I'm saying the thing that changed me was the real experience of trying it out
Yeah.
forced upon me by practical situation. And for a lot of rowers, it's not this that's going to get them doing a polarized program. It's a coach like you saying, this is what we're going to do. This is the philosophy. This is what we want you to buy into. So long as you're driving the volume, you should be seeing the adaptation. And you have to point out to people as they're doing the program that there are lots of benefits that come within the session. The session is more humane. It's more enjoyable in many ways, not always, because some people just like going out and beasting themselves. But you can make the sessions more interesting. You can see behind me, we've got the visual here. You can see behind me, I've got this great big TV screen. So I can sit and watch a football match when I'm doing that nice low intensity half marathon, and I can
Or you
concentrate
can
on it.
watch a Jack Burns YouTube video.
I can watch it. I do watch Jack Burns videos once in a while, but there's a limit, and I can't always do that. I was going to say I like watching movies, but the classic movie
I'll
to
make
watch.
some longer ones then.
Well, that's it. When I do UT2 training, a classic thing for me to watch would be a sort of Liam Neeson type movie.
Nice.
A movie
Okay.
that's got a little bit of a plot, but basically it's Liam Neeson just punching
Yeah.
guys every third scene. That's about the cognitive demand I can cope with. It is not so easy for me to sit and watch things over UT2 when you have to really, really engage
Yeah.
the brain. But it's at least it's a lot better to do that at UT2. Now, if I was doing a higher moderate intensity session, I'll probably struggle to even keep track with a Liam Neeson movie. That's the difference. And that back to rowing is important. If you want people to concentrate on the technical messages that are coming from the coach's launch, it's very hard to do that when you're doing rate 26 pieces on the water and the coach is screaming. I mean, everybody knows that. If you're out
Yeah.
doing those 500-meter session and the coach or even the cox is screaming at you, other than stay long, you really can't expect to do something sophisticated around the feel of the catch and make sure you're locked, all that kind of stuff. It's very hard.
So what you're saying is you don't need to look at UT2 heart rate. You can just judge it by if you can watch a Liam Neeson movie or not. And then that's when
Yeah,
you
I
know
think that's
you're
pretty good. The
mostly
Liam Neeson test, right?
yeah, fair enough. Okay, yeah, yeah. Cool. Okay.
Dwayne
So
Johnson and people are kind of the same. Depending, for younger people, Dwayne
yeah,
Johnson type
Marvel.
movies.
Yeah, yeah.
About that. Yeah,
Might
not too
upset some
much.
people there.
No complex dialogue. Don't try watching, Game of Thrones or things that actually
Yeah,
require you to connect lots of dots.
yeah. Okay, so yeah, I think that's like gives everybody a really good understanding on polarized training, and the why behind it and how you can go away and implement it. Also, which was really interesting for me is also you talking about having a bit of a not so much a hard and fast rule with it, but just starting to bring in some concepts of it, sort of just flipping your program upside down. I'd just like to get into some specifics in terms of um, say so some masters we coach, some of them will be racing 1K or 2K, and then likewise going into head of the head season again in August, which will come around quickly. How with a polarized training program, how much of it stays the same, and then how much of it is different in your opinion preparing for a 1K, a 2K, or a 5K? Doesn't have to be strict examples on each of those, but just broadly, how would you go about prepping for different distances using a polarized method?
It's very interesting, and this is a big hot topic in international rowing at the moment because after international rowing moves through the Paris Olympics this summer,
Yeah.
then we move to focusing for Los Angeles in 2028, where the distance is going to be 1,500 meters. So, I mean, it's quite a remarkable change. So a lot of the coaches are trying to get their head around, well, how are we going to change the training from 2K to 1,500? I think the answer to that is probably we probably will value a little bit more bulk in the rowers. We probably want a bit more weights. You probably want a bit more lean muscle mass, but not much else will change. If you were to go down to 1K, not much else would change. You'd probably go a little bit less volume, a little bit more intensity across the year, a little bit more emphasis in the intervals. But the transition from, I think, a 2K program to a 1K program, I don't think is huge.
Okay. Yeah.
But if you go from a 1K to a 500, that difference is huge. In other words, in fact, Steve Seiler, you won't be able to find this anymore, but he used to run a website many years ago called Masters Athlete Performance something, MAPP. You can probably still even find it on the archive, the web trawling archive that you can find. But anyway, he did some analysis looking at if you correlate people's 500-meter sprint times in a sample of rowers, if you correlate 500-meter times with their 2K, the correlation is pretty poor.
Yeah.
In other words, being very good over 500 meters, at least in a fairly homogeneous sample of rowers, it's a fairly similar in terms of ability. 500-meter time is not a great predictor of 2K time, but once you move up to about the 1K distance, that becomes a better predictor.
Hmm.
So very short anaerobically driven events of 500 meters or less are not very good predictors of 2K performance. And we know this because often the guys in the world that are very good over sprint distances on the air, they're usually not the best over 2K. They'll still pull a good 2K, no question. But if you wanted to make a really good 2K rower, you're not trying to make a good sprinter. So the training program for somebody doing 1K, 2K, 5K, broadly, those are very similar programs. And
Okay.
you're in the boundary of, well, how do you subtly adjust the program if you're going to do 5K versus 1K? The boat race is going to be this weekend, right? So that they're all 7K basically. So they're looking at something which does emphasize more duration, more longer intervals, things like that. They don't even have the time to do the very high volume that you might do in a classic 2K, just because of the nature of the compressed season when the students
Yeah.
turn up in August, September. But so how do we pull all that back together? I I my bottom line for anybody doing 1K or more, any distance 1K and above, I'm going to endorse that 80-20 broad approach. Low intensity is going to be the staple of your training, so long as you're doing 5, 6, 7, 8+ hours per week. I've got to add in that caveat. If you can do, again, my favorite number is 100K. If
Yeah.
you're a rower, I just say if you can do 100K on the water, on the air combined, don't worry about anything else, you'll do well. Same with school programs. If you can do 100K pretty on average across the year, you can't help but do well physiologically. So long as you've got the right parents and you inherited the right genes, you will flush out great physiology on 100K week on average.
I remember you saying before, I think we had you on for a webinar and you showed us a graph and it was after, the increases in fitness up to 100K, it's like a good straight line. And then
That's
after
right.
100K, it flattens out a bit. Is
That's
that
right.
right? Yeah.
That's a study of marathon runners looking at their training paces, and what you see is that you get these rapid improvements in marathon running performance up to around 100K. And broadly, running and rowing are fairly interchangeable in those distances. So it's the best evidence that I can give for why I use this 100K number. But if you go into lots of training programs around the world, what you will find is a lot of people doing 40, 50K per week, but they actually spend a lot of time at the boathouse and a lot of time training. Well, it doesn't take long.
Yeah.
I think I did 110, maybe 115K, 110 last week on the air. And that was 8 hours. 8 hours of training basically to get 110K. It doesn't take, you don't need to have a full-time training load, 16, 20 hours per week to be hitting that sort of number. And if you hit that sort of number, then I think above all else, volume is the base of any good training program. So until people start getting up to those sort of 80, 90, 100K per week, my answer is just keep building the low intensity work, and then put in one session of high intensity if you want. But as soon as you put in the high, so yeah, yesterday I do a 5K time trial. Well, I do a 5K warm up and a 5K time trial, and then I'm wrecked. That's it. I don't want to do anything else. And that means I'm only doing 10K for that particular day. So it's not enough if you only do that 6 times a week, that's not enough to get you up to 100K. If you want to be doing these targets that I think really are consistent with competitive performances, for almost any age group, outside of elite training programs, outside of the real international and the really competitive national stuff, Henley Regatta, things like that. 100K a week is enough. If you want to go and be really competitive at Henley Regatta, 100K per week in a schools program is going to get you there. 100K a week in a club program at Henley, it's borderline. You probably might have to scoot up. All I'm saying there is the first thing anybody who wants to be competitive should be thinking about is, how do I build my volume of rowing so that on average I'm getting
Mm.
toward that 100K per week?
And
And
how
you can
and how can
edit
you do
that
it
a little bit.
consistently?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's going back to your point of why polarized training and having your UT2 easy enough is so you can do it. It's not just one 100K week, it's
You've got it.
a
You've
winter.
got it.
Yeah.
That's the argument for polarized training. A lot of people never get toward that 100K threshold, either because they're inefficient in their time use. They can spend 3 hours at the boathouse and actually only
Yeah.
do 1 hour of actual
No
paddling,
more
rowing.
chit chat.
No more chit chat. That's it. You've got to get the
No,
work done.
no more stretching.
Well,
I'm kidding
if you
on.
don't
I'm
mind
kidding
spending
on.
that time, then the stretching's got its value.
No, I'm kidding on. I'm just being annoying. Yeah, I remember you saying that actually on another when we had you on before, and it's something we actually hadn't focused on enough is just saving those 5 minutes. 5 minutes before, 5 minutes after. Um, I used to be obsessive about prepping for even when I was full-time training, like just being super efficient, getting in and out the door. And what are some ways that maybe you actually go about being efficient with your time? Obviously you've got your erg at home, but do you have any like little habits that you do that's allow you to do that?
I
Um,
mean, having everything organized, I mean, you can see behind me that the heart rate monitor is there. Everything is set up so that as
yeah,
soon as I sit down, everything's ready to go as quickly as you possibly can. For my family, don't come in that door. When I'm rowing, don't come and bother me to get more time on your computer or wherever you lost this thing. It, the training time is kept separate. But I'm an old guy basically. Don't worry about me. But when I have gone round lots of the private schools, particularly in England, so I go and do talks for
the
various schools.
faff. Oh my God.
The FAF, the FAF at a club program and underfunded programs is
Yeah.
huge. The amount of time lost looking for a seat or a top nut
Oh,
that somebody's taken off your boat,
does
and
my head in.
every 4.5 minutes, that's 1 kilometer lost.
Yeah.
But when you go to these very polished, well-staffed programs, Eton, Headington School, Radley, everything's lined up. The boys come
Yeah.
down, they know their seats, they know what they're doing. They put the oar out, they put the boat in the water, they get out and they get the work done. They do those 80, 90, 100 kilometers
I
per week. They don't
remember
waste time.
Pinson in Matt Pinson's book. I remember it just stuck in my head. He talked about how when he was a junior and he went and trained with Redgrave and Holmes in their pair. And one thing that really stood out to him is before and after each session, they came in as juniors and they landed on the pontoon. Oh, how was that? A bit of chit chat, blah, blah, blah. Oh, now we'll do the gate. And they said by the time they were undoing the gate, Redgrave and his, the Olympic pair, they were already boat away and just off getting changed.
And let me tell you, because you mentioned Matt Pinson. Matt Pinson went to Eton College, and I went down and spent a day at Eton College, looking at how the rowing boys lived, and that included having lunch with them. And it's the most remarkable thing when you sit at Eton College in one of the houses having lunch.
Did you wear the
If
top
you
hat
don't
and the
no,
coattails?
luckily we didn't have. It wasn't the dinner. It was just lunch, so I could turn up, no problem. But what was very interesting was how quick the boys were eating. It was quick, 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 because the whole day is really tight on time.
Mm,
And the lunch, I couldn't believe how quickly, as soon as you finished your plate, the next plate was in front of you, and you moved on because everything was on a very, very efficient time schedule because the
mm,
whole day is basically mapped out. And so it's very interesting, that same philosophy of time efficiency. And that's critical when you have people who are busy and have other things. Rowing has to fit in with the
hmm.
rest of their lives. Now, if you're a full-time athlete, you can afford a bit more time. And that's what you get at Caversham. You get a bit more time to try to recover, to relax, to have a bit of a social life. But then that's because rowing is the job. Rowing is the
Yeah.
main business. And even that time is very efficiently spent.
Yeah, one thing I like to say as well, it's, you're not a rower when if you've got a job and you're not a rower when you push off the pontoon. You're a rower as soon as you're going to rowing. As soon as you grab your kit bag or decide, right now I'm going to rowing, it's like you're in athlete mode. So trying to maximize, that training window. And part of that is, like you say, being efficient and being focused on how can I make the most of when work finishes or you have your own time.
That's how, I mean, this is this concept of marginal gains. When you are a full-time athlete and you're competing against rowers in other countries that are also full-time athletes, one of the ways you try to squeeze everything out of your body and out of your rowing development is the 24-hour athlete, thinking about the consequences of what you do in your
Yeah,
rest time for how that might impact on the quality of your rowing training. So managing your mental health, managing relationships, managing your studies, if you're doing any studies around that, all of that has to be very time efficient, if you really want to manage a busy life, basically,
for
and be a
sure.
very successful rower.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, loads of value there. I think hopefully, some people are hearing that and getting aha moments. Um, but one last question I wanted to ask is just a bit about, so often, people will come to a new training concept or be open to it when they're struggling. So often that is a plateau for someone or even like a bit of regression as well. What sort of advice would you give to somebody? What should they be looking at? Maybe without being able to dive into their Strava or their training history, how would you go about giving tips on somebody that's plateaued and struggling, and despite, maybe their best efforts?
I mean, again, everything will be specific to the particular person in the example. You got to figure out, well, why are they plateauing? First of all, for many elite rowers, plateaus are inevitable, and it's just
Yeah,
you've done years of training. You've done your 552K erg, and you're just not going to go any faster. There are plateaus that are inevitable, and then all you're trying to do is find little gains. In other words, there comes a point in time where the gains are small, and unless you have very accurate ways of measuring people's performance, there's a limit to that. It gets very hard to avoid the plateau problem at some point. The other thing, though, of course, is one of the reasons people might feel they're plateauing is because they're testing too much. They're doing
okay,
too
testing
many,
too much.
yeah, testing too much, and they're just, it's very exciting when you first take up the new season. Those 30-minute powers, 30-minute distances, they go up without any effort, and then you
Yeah,
get toward March and things start to plateau.
yeah, yeah,
By the way, part of the reason people see the plateaus there is because they test on the erg. Well, when do you get your best erg scores? Well, it's when you've been doing the bulk of your training time on the erg, which is the winter. So it is not surprising that people's best 2K ergs often coincide with the end of the winter season, the start of the spring period, because they've just come off the bulk of erg training. And now they're moving to do lots more water time. In other words, as you move through the season, you may see plateaus in your erg score simply because you're shifting more of your training time to on the water and less of the erg. That's not the same as saying you aren't performing. That's not the same as saying you aren't getting better where it really matters on the water. It's just because the way you do your testing is focused on a device where you spend most of your time training in the winter on the erg, corresponding to performance gains on the erg at that point in the season. Why you're plateauing and how you're defining that plateau is very important. I don't care if people are not pulling a great erg score in the summer months. Well, I care about what people are doing on the oar in the boat. That's what's most important. So recognizing that the way you test your performance and not testing too much is critical, particularly testing too much on an insensitive testing device is a really poor way to go. And it's going to encourage people to think they're plateauing when in truth, the way to encourage people is to see, well, you're doing this training. Do you feel better in the water? Do you feel sharper? Do you feel your technique is improving?
Yeah.
Well, then that's fine. Have that focus on that. Sometimes it's good to just trust the subjective if you're having these plateaus. So the plateau thing depends on what is it that's plateauing and what are you doing to evaluate your progress. And sometimes just saying, be patient, it's
Yeah.
coming, and focusing on the ultimate goal, which is on water. For the
Yeah, and
most.
that's such a hard thing about training is that delayed gratification sometimes as well. So having that faith, like you say, is key. Um, yeah, unfortunately, Charlie, that's like all we have time for. Maybe 1 minute. Again, I would of
Go
course
for
love to
it.
have you on for another podcast another time. You're also like super educated in sports nutrition as well, so we can maybe have a talk about that. But yeah, just like maybe 30 seconds, 60 seconds. If you can say what's your kind of current project. So first off, actually, if you haven't checked it out, advanced rowing, don't let the title as well put you off if you're newer to rowing or any concepts. It's explained really, really well, and you just get such a good perspective from other coaches. Um, Charlie co-authored on it. It's a fantastic book. I'll link it in the bio. But yeah, Charlie, 30, 60 seconds. What's kind of new for you? What's on the horizon? Or I don't know, is it still top secret? So this is just the little part of the podcast where Charlie and I talked a bit about what he's working on, and it's basically just involving some things with body weight and weight loss. So if that is a trigger for you, then please just end the podcast here. If you're interested in it and it's safe for you to listen to it, then yeah, please do continue. But I'll just give you a brief 5 to 10 seconds to allow you to stop the podcast if you prefer to.
No. I mean, one of the things I'm really playing with at the moment, I could have talked about one possible benefit of all this UT2 stuff is to develop people's mechanical efficiency. That's the concept of when you exercise, you produce energy, but you take the energy and you turn it into power and work
Yeah.
on the ergometer. We don't talk a lot about that in rowing. We talk about efficiency, but we don't talk about it in this terms of, well, you've got this amount of oxygen, how much work can you output? One of the things on another conversation maybe is to talk about, well, what drives mechanical efficiency? Why do two people both using the same amount of oxygen, why does one person transfer
Yeah.
that into 220 watts where the other person is at 200 watts? There are lots around training to develop mechanical efficiency and the importance of mechanical efficiency that I'm most interested in. But the project I'm working on at the moment is a little idea. What I wanted to say, well, what if people lost weight? What if people became more lean, lose some of the fat mass? For middle-aged athletes, sometimes they gain a little bit extra around the core. What if they could lose that? What would that do to improve their rowing? One of the ways we're simulating this at the moment is not losing weight, but actually putting weight on. And what I've been doing recently, and we'll carry on this summer, is we get people to come and row on the rowing machine in our lab, and we get them to wear 5 and 10 kilogram weight vests. And we look at the
Interesting.
effect on their oxygen cost. And what you can see, as you might expect, it's not easy to show this, but when you put people with 10 kilo weight vests, which you can row with, low intensity, moderate intensity, it increases people's oxygen cost. In other words, being heavier costs more of your available VO2 max to row. So what I'm trying to show is, well, if you could exercise people with slightly lower body fat, what would that do to their oxygen use, and what would that do to their mechanical efficiency? In other words, I want to show that what we're seeing is you can disturb people's mechanical efficiency by manipulating the amount of mass that they're shifting back and forward
Okay.
along the erg rails. On water, things get much more complicated, but in the lab, we're going in the right direction. Not easy to
Awesome.
show it. We need a lot of subjects to show it, so it takes time.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I'll be tuning into that and looking forward to hearing what the kind of results and stuff are. But that sounds super interesting. And yeah, we're lucky to have people like you in the sport, Charlie, that are looking to these new areas that are pushing the boundaries. So yeah, hope everybody found lots of value. Again, I'll link Charlie's book in the description. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments or shoot them over to me and I can pass them to Charlie. Don't spam Charlie. Spam me, okay? This is, I'm the host. Anyways, okay. Right, Charlie. Hope you have a good rest of the day, and yeah, we'll have you on again soon, hopefully.
Good man. Thanks for the
Okay,
chat. I enjoyed that. Good fun. All the
awesome.
best.
Cheers, cheers, Charlie.